Why you translate in your head? You know that tiny pause you get when someone speaks English to you? Maybe they ask, "What did you do yesterday?" And your brain suddenly freezes. You understand the question, but there's that 2-second gap before you answer. Inside your head, you first think about the idea, you translate it from your own language, then you pull out each English word one by one. You say, "I went to my friend's house." The sentence is right, but the whole process feels heavy. That delay you feel isn't about grammar or vocabulary. It's because you're still translating, not thinking, in English. Every learner does this in the beginning. It's actually how your mind was trained. From day one, you learned English through your native words. Apple equals something, cat equals something, book equals something. So your brain didn't connect idea to English word, it connected native word to English word. There's always that middleman. And every time you speak, you walk through it again. Idea, native word, English word. That loop is comfortable, but slow. Here's the thing, it feels safe. Your first language is your emotional comfort zone, the place where everything makes sense, where words carry memories. So when you step outside that zone into English, your brain automatically clings to old anchors. It translates because it doesn't fully trust itself in English yet. It's not lack of intelligence, it's your mind looking for stability. Children don't do this. They don't need control, they play with chaos. They hear sounds, guess, repeat, adjust. Adults do the opposite. We want correctness and certainty before we open our mouths. We build little safety buffers. Let me check if I'm saying this right. That mental safety net is the translation habit. And it's exactly what slows you down. The truth is, behind the scenes, your brain works like a network of highways. Your native language is the big, smooth highway, automatic, fast. English is the smaller road, still under construction. So when you want to speak, your brain instinctively jumps back to the main road to feel safe, drives a bit, then turns again toward English. It's not inefficiency, it's protection. But that switching steals speed every single time. Neurologically, this is called cross-language interference. Both languages compete for space and control. Your brain must inhibit one while activating the other. The part that does that, the prefrontal cortex, is also the part responsible for focus, decision-making, and self-control. So when you translate while speaking, you burn the same mental energy you'd use solving math problems or controlling your emotions. That's why even a short English conversation can feel exhausting. English isn't the problem, switching is. Now think about this, the moment you stop translating, English begins to flow. Words appear faster, grammar feels lighter, and ideas start forming exactly in English form. It happens because your brain no longer runs two systems. It picks one language and stays in it. That's what fluent speakers do. They think inside the language, not across languages. Most learners believe they need perfect grammar first. Then, once they know enough, they'll start thinking in English. That's completely upside down. Grammar knowledge doesn't create fluency. Fluency creates grammar accuracy through repetition and intuition. When you force yourself to think in English, even imperfectly, your brain starts building direct concept-to-word connections. Every raw, clumsy sentence you speak teaches your neurons that English is safe. And once the brain accepts that safety, speed comes naturally. You have two memory systems working at all times, declarative and procedural. Declarative memory is slow, conscious, it remembers lessons, charts, flashcards. Procedural memory is fast, automatic, it remembers habits. Fluent speech lives in procedural memory. Knowledge alone belongs to declarative memory. Translation keeps you trapped there, analyzing rather than acting. Thinking directly in English transfers that knowledge into intuition. It rewires your neural circuits to operate without supervision. It's like driving a car. At first you're thinking about every pedal, every lane. Then suddenly you're just moving. You're not thinking the moves. You are the moves. Let's look at comprehension. You've probably watched movies with subtitles and thought, I understand everything. But if you remove the subtitles, comprehension drops instantly. Why? Because your brain was never processing English directly. It was decoding through invisible translation. True understanding means your ears map sounds straight to meaning. No middle language needed. You bypass the translator in your head, and that connection saves tremendous time and energy. Emotionally, translation hides fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of sounding silly, fear of not belonging. When you speak your first language, mistakes feel harmless. They don't touch your identity. In English, every mistake feels personal. That emotional sting pushes you back into the safety of translation. But psychology shows repetition dissolves fear. Each time you speak directly in English, even with errors, you tell your brain, I'm safe here. After enough repetitions, fear becomes boredom, and boredom becomes comfort. That's when thinking in English finally becomes natural. You'll notice signs of transition when English thoughts start showing up randomly. Small things like, where's my key? Or, I'm late again. At first it surprises you, not because the sentence is perfect, but because it popped up by itself. That's the moment your brain has begun to operate in English mode. You've crossed from bilingual to biliterate, from translation to genuine fluency. As you move through this phase, grammar doubts fade. You no longer mentally check, is this correct? You simply feel what sounds right. That feeling is linguistic intuition, the skill native speakers use every day. They break rules constantly, but their ears guide correctness. You can reach that level. It's not a gift, it's a habit. Every day you spend inside English sharpens that instinct. Here's an analogy I love. Imagine your phone's operating system. When you switch it from your native language to English, it feels weird for a few days. The icons look strange, settings hard to find. But you don't switch back. You keep using it. That's exactly how the mind adjusts. You change the system language and stop translating back. After a few weeks, English becomes your internal interface. So the goal isn't to silence translation through force, it's to make it unnecessary. Don't fight it, just outgrow it. Translation is a training wheel, thinking is the bike itself. Every time you catch yourself translating, pause and redirect. Ask, what am I picturing? What am I feeling? Then describe that picture directly in English, even if it's rough. That single conscious act rewires the path. Do it hundreds of times and the old route fades away. This transformation moves in clear stages. First, you depend on translation completely. Second, simple emotions and daily phrases start forming in English. Third, complex ideas begin to reshape themselves while still mixing two languages. And finally, English becomes autopilot. You dream, doubt, argue, and plan entirely in English. Translation doesn't disappear because you suppress it. It disappears because you don't need it anymore. So, thinking in English isn't magic. It's measurable, neurological progression, building direct roads between concept and expression. Every thought you build directly in English strengthens those roads. Bit by bit, English stops being something you use and becomes something you think with. At that point, the world you see, its colors, patterns, and voices, link directly to English words. You're not learning English anymore, you're living it. And once you live in a language, speed, clarity, and confidence arrive together. That's exactly where real fluency begins. inside your mind's wiring. Not in vocabulary lists, not in grammar books, but in the quiet moment when your brain finally stops asking for permission to translate and simply speaks. The science of thinking in a new language. Have you ever wondered what actually happens inside your head when you start to think in another language? What's really going on in that invisible space, between hearing a word and understanding it, between wanting to say something and finally saying it? It's not just vocabulary, it's machinery. Your brain isn't a dictionary. It's a living, rewiring system that responds to every word, every sound, every intention. And when you learn a new language, you're not just memorizing, you're literally building a second operating system inside the same brain. Let's start with something that science now proves clearly. Language is not stored in one spot. There's no little English drawer and French drawer. Language lives in a distributed network. The auditory cortex for sounds, the motor cortex for mouth movement, Broca's and Wernicke's areas for production and comprehension, plus the hippocampus for memory. They're like members of a band constantly improvising together. Every time you hear, repeat, or imagine a sentence, that network lights up. But learning a new language doesn't mean copying the first one. It means forging brand new neural paths through that same network, and at first, those paths are tiny dirt trails. Think of your first language as a 6-lane highway. Smooth, fast, full of familiar signs. The new language starts as a narrow path through the forest. The more you practice, the more people walk it, and the trail starts turning into a road. Eventually it gets paved, then lit, then even expanded. That's neuroplasticity, your brain physically reshaping itself according to usage. Every repetition is construction work. Every mistake is pavement laid down. When you force yourself to think in English, you're literally sending traffic through that new path so it grows stronger. The hard part is enduring, that early stage when the road feels unstable and full of potholes. Now, your brain has its own logic for efficiency. It categorizes languages as systems of prediction. In your native tongue, it can predict the next word almost automatically because it has millions of stored sequences from past use. But in a new language, predictions fail constantly. Every time that happens, the brain releases a small dose of noradrenaline, a stress signal, which is why foreign conversation feels slightly tense at first. But here's the twist. Learning comes from prediction error. Every wrong guess pushes your brain to update the model. That's why discomfort isn't a sign of weakness, it's the sign that your brain is actively upgrading itself. Cognitive scientists call this transition a control shift, moving from declarative processing to procedural processing. At the declarative stage, you consciously recall rules. Third person plural, add, s, past tense, irregular form. It's effortful and slow, powered by the hippocampus. In procedural mode, those same rules become invisible actions, managed by the basal ganglia, the habit engine of the brain. That's the real meaning of fluency. Rules vanish because they're internalized into automated sequences. You experience this kind of shift in other skills too. When you drive a car, you don't think, step on brake, glance at mirror, release clutch. It just happens. The early days of learning are clunky because you depend on the analytical network, prefrontal cortex supervising every move. Thinking in English is about gradually handing control over to the procedural system so words come out as habits, not choices. Neuroscience is brutally clear on one thing. Your brain resists multitasking. When you translate, you're not switching fast between two complete systems, you're forcing them to run simultaneously. Each switch pulls energy from the anterior cingulate cortex, the part responsible for conflict monitoring. That's why you feel that flicker of mental heat while translating. Fluency happens the moment the conflict disappears. One system takes dominance, the other goes quiet. You stop debating between two codes and start believing in one. Now, inside every bilingual brain there's an invisible rivalry. Scientists call it language competition. Both systems fight for neural resources, like two apps trying to use the same processor at once. When you reach high fluency, the competition turns into cooperation. They share files instead of overriding each other. You begin to sense that your mind doesn't have two languages. It has one conceptual core capable of expressing itself through different linguistic filters. That's when translation becomes obsolete. You begin thinking in ideas, choosing the code that best expresses them. Let's talk about mental imagery. When you hear dog, you don't visualize 4 letters, you picture the animal. The image appears before the word. In your first language, that mapping between sound and image is instant. A new language interrupts it with translation. Neuroscientist Guillaume Thierry discovered through EEG studies that bilinguals initially process words in both languages, even when they think they're using one. The native concept activates first, then the foreign equivalent a few milliseconds later. Over time, that delay vanishes, literally disappears, as the second language builds its own direct link to imagery. So when someone says dog, your brain jumps straight to the image, skipping the old bridge. That's the mechanical signature of genuine thinking in English. It's not abstract. It's measurable in brain waves. Another key principle in this process is embodiment. Your brain doesn't store language as text. It stores it as sensation. The verb run lights up both the language area and the motor strip that controls your legs. Taste activates gustatory regions. If you keep learning by reading lists, you're feeding only the symbolic side, the semantic shell, without connecting the sensory circuits. That's why memorized vocabulary feels limp in conversation. It's detached from the body. When you think in English, your language becomes embodied again. You're not saying run, you're feeling the run. That's why mimicking, acting, and emotional tone are essential. They bind words to physical experience. Here's another scientific surprise. Fluency is not just about language. It's about timing. Each language has its own rhythm, tiny temporal patterns encoded in milliseconds between syllables. English has stress-timed rhythm. Many other languages are syllable-timed. Your auditory cortex learns those patterns implicitly. When you think in English, your brain's internal metronome adjusts itself. That's why people who still think in their native rhythm sound robotic, even when their grammar is perfect. They're speaking English through a foreign clock. The true rewiring happens when that internal clock resynchronizes. It's a rhythmic conversion, not a grammatical one. And now let's dive even deeper. Dopaminergic learning. Dopamine is the chemical that marks experiences as rewarding. Every time you manage to express a thought directly in English, without translating, your brain gives you a micro-reward. It's a tiny hit of satisfaction, but it's crucial. That little spark tells your neurons, keep this path alive. The more such moments you collect, the faster the network stabilizes. That's why speaking freely builds fluency while passive study rarely does. Active recall produces dopamine, passive exposure doesn't. Fluency is chemistry in action. Another piece of science people rarely mention is cognitive economy. The brain is lazy by design. It always chooses the shortest route to convey meaning. Translation violates that rule because it doubles the path. Once your brain notices this inefficiency, it starts pruning. Unused connections weaken. Networks that fire together wire together, while those that remain silent fade. So if you consistently think in English, during walks, while cooking, even while talking to yourself, your brain elects English as the primary route for certain contexts. That's neuroselection. You're literally training your mind to prefer efficiency over habit. Let's talk emotion again, scientifically. Emotional memories are stored in the amygdala, strongly linked to language centers. Each language carries emotional weight depending on when and how it was learned. Childhood language becomes emotionally saturated. Later languages often start emotionally flat. That's why people say foreign languages feel less real. but repeated emotionally charged use, humor, gratitude, frustration, injects affect into the system. Every laugh, every argument in English rewires that link. Once emotion lives in English, translation instinct fades automatically because you're no longer interpreting life through another emotional lens. You're feeling in English. So, when teachers say immerse yourself, what they're really prescribing is full sensory and emotional coding. It's not passive bathing in English media, it's reprogramming the emotional circuits of your brain. You want English not just in your ears, but in your muscles, your gestures, your dreams. Once those circuits learn to fire in English context, translation becomes neurologically pointless. Now let's consider working memory capacity. The human brain can comfortably hold about 7 chunks of information at once. Translation doubles that load, because you're handling both input and output at the same time. That overload is why speech freezes. When you think in English, you free up half the memory load instantly. Clarity emerges because you're processing one code, one rhythm, one emotional tone. Less mental noise, more cognitive bandwidth. Some people ask, but can I ever turn off my first language? The answer from neuroscience is nuanced, not completely, and you don't have to. What happens is dynamic suppression. The moment you engage deeply in English, the neural activation of the other language dips below threshold. It's still there, but dormant. You're not erasing it, you're prioritizing a network. The power is in control, not deletion. Fluent bilinguals can flip dominance depending on context, at work in English, at home in another language, without conflict. That's an advanced executive skill, not a flaw. Now, if we could visualize the inside of your brain while you switch, it would look like city lights shifting patterns. The moment you start forming sentences in English, a network from prefrontal to temporal regions lights together in synchrony. When you translate, there's crosstalk, 2 half-lit networks pulling energy from each other. Over time, the synchronous pattern becomes faster, more stable, until one clean color fills the map. That's the brain's way of declaring, this is home base now. But it's not just about neurons, it's about attention, the rarest resource. Attention decides which circuits get reinforced. Every time you drift into translation, you're spending that resource on analysis instead of connection. Thinking in English redirects attention to the concept itself rather than to linguistic control. It transforms language from object to medium. The same way a swimmer stops noticing the water, you'll stop noticing English, and that's the ultimate goal. Modern research in psycholinguistics even quantifies this change. Reaction time tests show that highly fluent bilinguals access meaning directly in the target language in less than 200 milliseconds, indistinguishable from native speeds. Early learners take more than 400 milliseconds because of translation detours. So every microsecond you save comes from neural optimization, not from memorizing grammar. You are literally becoming faster at thinking because your brain is rewiring for efficiency. So what does all this science mean for you as a learner? It means fluency isn't a matter of talent, it's biology, experience, and repetition. You can't think your way into fluency through logic alone, but you can train your brain into it through design, by manipulating attention, emotion, rhythm, and reward. If you consistently imagine, speak, and even daydream in English, your neurons adapt. They have to. They follow mathematical rules of probability, the most frequent connections dominate. The rest get pruned away. Here's a mind-bending fact, the human cortex can literally relocate function. In blind individuals, the visual cortex gets repurposed for touch and sound. That means your brain doesn't ask permission to reallocate, it always optimizes for what you repeat. So yes, your mind can choose English as its primary interface for thought, just like it could choose math, music, or movement, but only through continuous, embodied repetition. And maybe the most important discovery of all, language learning changes not only how you speak but how you perceive reality. Psycholinguist Lara Boroditsky showed that speakers of different languages perceive time, space, and color differently because of linguistic framing. When you think in English, you're literally adopting a new cognitive lens, one that prioritizes action over state, structure over implication, directness over abstraction. You start thinking in a slightly different logic. It's subtle but profound. Your perception of time, agency, and even emotion realigns with English patterns. So thinking in English isn't just about convenience, it's about exploring who you can be in another cognitive universe. You're not translating words, you're transforming perspectives. Each shift in syntax reshapes how you define yourself in relation to the world. That's not metaphor, that's empirical linguistics. Let's close with one image. Imagine your mind as a night sky filled with constellations, each star a memory, each cluster a concept. Your first language drew one map of connections between those stars. Learning English lets you draw another map on the same sky, connecting the dots differently. The stars are the same, your memories, your feelings, but the pattern, the geometry of thought, transforms. The more you think in English, the more that new constellation glows until it becomes the one you navigate by. And that, right there, is the science behind thinking in a new language. It's a complete neurological remodeling, chemistry, rhythm, attention, and emotion converging into a single fluent system. Once that system stabilizes, you've crossed the invisible border, where English stops being a subject and becomes a state of mind. Rewiring your mental loops, from grammar rules to thought patterns. Let's be honest for a second, most of us learned English like we were assembling furniture, with too many instruction sheets. We memorized rules, exceptions, tense charts, and every time we opened our mouths we were mentally flipping through that manual. Wait, present perfect or past simple? Do I need an article here? Is this plural? All those micro-decisions pile up, creating friction between what you want to say and how you're allowed to say it. That friction isn't language, it's a loop, a circular mechanism built by studying forms instead of experiences. This chapter is about breaking that loop and rebuilding a new one, the thought pattern loop, so the structure of English stops being a cage and starts being a pathway. Think of your brain as a vast network of habits. Everything you do, walk, type, smile, follows automatic loops, trigger, routine, reward. When you speak a language, the same architecture applies. The trigger is the idea you want to express. The routine is the way you normally convert it into words. The reward is communication, the pleasure of being understood. In your first language, that process feels seamless because the routine is ancient, well-oiled, optimized through thousands of hours of real use. When you switch to English, you're suddenly driving through a brand new circuit full of detours, speed limits, and traffic lights called grammar rules. Every time you try to accelerate, the conscious mind says, "Wait, let me check the manual." That's the mental loop we have to rewire. Grammar itself isn't the enemy. It's structure, necessary architecture, but the way you've approached it might be the wrong wiring. Grammar becomes paralyzing when you treat it as law rather than pattern. Fluency grows when grammar becomes invisible rhythm. Native speakers don't recite formulae before they talk, they rely on patterns strengthened through countless emotional interactions. They don't think, subject, verb, object, they simply think the idea in that sequence. The goal is not to reject grammar but to internalize its flow until it mirrors the way you think. Psycholinguistics tells us that grammar is stored as procedural memory once mastered. Procedural means habit, not rule. You don't remember how to conjugate, you do it. The switch happens when your active focus moves from form to function, from saying it right to making it real. Speaking without translating or checking grammar sounds risky at first, but it's exactly what converts fragile knowledge into neural automation. Every fluent person went through that cognitive leap where mistakes were allowed and rhythm was prioritized. You can't develop intuitive accuracy until you stop obsessing over mechanical accuracy. Let me put that into a neurological framework. When you use analytical grammar thinking, the prefrontal cortex is hyperactive, the conscious control center. But every skill you ever learned, reading, writing, needed repetition. So why should language be different? It consumes glucose like a hungry engine, monitoring every process. But when language becomes procedural, activation shifts toward the basal ganglia and supplementary motor areas, the circuits responsible for skilled automatic behavior. The less conscious supervision you exert, the faster and smoother language emerges. Rewiring those circuits takes exposure, error, and trust, not perfection. You train the brain to choose efficiency over caution. Now here's where the loop metaphor gets powerful. Every time you speak or think in English, your brain runs through micro-routines. Some of them help, others slow you down. Let's examine one, the translation loop. Trigger, you have an idea. Old routine, you translate to your native structure, check grammar, then convert words. Reward, you manage to say something. The cost, delay, frustration, and uneven rhythm. New loop, you start from concept, visualize directly in English syntax, let rhythm dictate order. Reward, speed and clarity. Repeat that loop enough times and your brain locks it as default. How do we rebuild those loops practically? Through conscious awareness and contextual immersion. Instead of memorizing isolated sentences, start noticing how grammar expresses movement of thought. Listen to native speakers, not for vocabulary, but for structure of emotion. Notice how they use modals to express shades of certainty, might, should, could. Notice how past tense often serves as psychological distance rather than time reference. These subtle logic patterns are the foundation of English thought. Grammar isn't arbitrary, it's philosophy encoded in syntax. Every language builds a worldview. The English worldview emphasizes linearity of time, clear agent-action relationships, explicit sequence. That's why verbs carry power in English, they drive sentences forward like small engines. Many other languages focus more on states, context, or relational balance. When you start thinking in English, you unconsciously adopt this dynamic worldview. You start noticing cause before consequence, intention before reaction. That mental architecture drives fluency because it's the natural rhythm of the language itself. You're not just speaking differently, you're thinking chronologically. Let's look at the mechanics of sentence formation in your mind. The order in which ideas appear affects output speed. When you think in your original language, the first concept activated might be an overall scene, broad, vague, and only later you pick the verb. In English mental architecture, verbs come early. The brain selects action first, then adds parameters. To speak fast in English, you have to train yourself to think verbs first. That's rewiring at the conceptual level, not grammar practice. Cognitive psychologists have experimented with this change. When bilingual adults describe the same picture in different languages, their eye movements change. In English, eyes track the actor first, the doer, while in other languages they focus more on the environment. That proves how grammar shapes perception itself. Repetition reshapes attention. When you practice describing actions visually in English, your perceptual loops start favoring English logic. That's brain rewiring in real time. The fascinating part is that you can simulate this process even alone. Inner speech, the voice in your head, follows the same neural patterns as spoken speech. So every time you silently narrate your environment in English, you're exercising the same circuits a conversation would. That means fluent thinking doesn't require other people, it requires internal dialogue framed correctly. Replace silent translation with direct English imaging. Don't say in your mind, "The cup is on the table," translated from your first language. Just see it and let the English phrase surface naturally. That's micro-training for neural restructuring. Let's address fear again. Because rewiring always triggers resistance. The prefrontal cortex hates losing control. It associates uncertainty with danger. So when you abandon rule checking, anxiety may spike. But neuroscientific evidence shows that slight stress combined with reward accelerates learning. When you manage to express one full idea fluidly, the brain releases dopamine, reinforcing the new loop instantly. That's how confidence grows chemically, not motivationally. Reward is built into biology. One of the most damaging habits among advanced learners is grammar self-monitoring during speech. You start talking, then halfway through, your brain whispers, "Wait, was that past perfect?" That internal interruption breaks fluency, not because of the mistake, but because of the divided attention. Fluent speakers make micro-corrections unconsciously, without interrupting flow. They reshape grammar after the sentence ends, not during it. The trick is post-monitoring, not in-monitoring. Let meaning move first, repair structure later. Meaning leads, grammar follows. Now imagine your mental language processor as a complex circuit board. Each rule you memorized created a switch. The more switches you flip consciously, the slower the electricity travels. The act of rewiring means rerouting electricity through macro patterns, larger circuits that encapsulate smaller grammar rules. Instead of flipping 10 switches for one idea, one macro switch handles them all automatically. You build those macro switches through pattern exposure, phrases, chunks, formulaic expressions. That's why native-like fluency often sounds like memorized phrases. It's actually neuroefficiency. "I've been meaning to tell you" is one single macro switch, not 7 tiny ones. Pattern training outperforms rule training because it compresses grammar into instinct. Every time you hear and reuse a phrase in natural context, you're engraving a new neural shortcut. The pattern becomes stored in the motor cortex as a speech routine. You're not thinking, you're executing. And execution is faster than recollection. So when designing your learning, aim for loop consistency, not loop perfection. Repetition builds stability, perfection builds hesitation. Let's shift to spatial metaphor, something dramatically different between languages. English tends to locate time and space, ahead, behind, forward, backward. You say, "Look forward to, back in the day." Train your thoughts to visualize time as directional motion. You see yourself moving through events. This mental framing changes how your memory organizes experiences. If you can adopt this visualization, English starts feeling natural instead of foreign, because you're thinking along its native geometry. The grammar tense isn't just form, it's temporal mapping of thought. Let's talk identity for a moment. The language you think and influences how you construct self. In languages rich with aspect rather than tense, identity is often contextual. I was feeling. In English, identity is action-based. I did, I said, I became. So as you rewire toward English thought patterns, your storytelling instinct changes. You move from describing states to narrating decisions. That's why English learners often sound more assertive after fluency, because the grammar amplifies agency. You're reprogramming not just syntax, but personality architecture. But rewiring also demands that you forgive mistakes early. The brain can't form new patterns under constant correction. Too much focus on fixing errors reinforces the anxiety loop instead of the fluency loop. Treat mistakes as data, not sins. Each one reveals where the circuit misfired so you can adjust in the next round. Precision develops naturally once flow is stabilized. That's the paradox. The less you worry about speaking correctly, the quicker you start speaking correctly. Here's a powerful exercise grounded in cognitive conditioning. Every day, choose one ordinary action, making coffee, checking emails, and narrate it in English internally. Describe what you do as you do it. I'm pouring, I'm waiting, I'm taking. No grammar thinking, just rhythmic observation. This trains your brain to synchronize thought with expression. After a few weeks, you'll notice the distance between thoughts and words shrinking. That's measurable rewiring, the latency drop between concept activation and verbal output. The mind stops rehearsing and begins performing. You might ask, when will I know the rewiring is complete? It never fully ends, the circuits keep evolving. But there's a clear threshold. It's when you begin conceptualizing grammar rather than memorizing it. You start recognizing patterns as logic, not rules. You hear yourself using structures unconsciously and understanding their emotional weight. You no longer separate grammar from meaning, they fuse. That's the sign that your brain has switched operating modes. Let's step briefly into linguistic neuroscience. The left inferior frontal gyrus, Broca's area, handles both syntactic processing and sequential control. In bilinguals who reach high fluency, neuroimaging shows reduced activation there compared to learners. That reduction means efficiency. They no longer compute grammar consciously, it runs as implicit sequencing. Rewiring transitions you from computational load to automatic synchronization. You achieve silence inside, the analytical chatter fades, letting rhythm carry cognition. Another scientific insight connects fluency to frequency mapping. The brain prefers commonly co-occurring pairs and sequences because they appear predictable. That's why listening, not studying, is vital. You give your auditory cortex a database of expected patterns. The more predictable English feels to your brain, the less resistance it shows. Prediction is comfort. Comfort breeds speed. Now imagine the broader result of rewiring. Instead of separate English and native circuits, you have shared cognitive architecture. Ideas flow in universal conceptual language first, then English emerges as the default verbal code. This merge enhances creativity too, because dual-language thinkers access wider conceptual range. Thinking in English sharpens logic and structure. Thinking in your first language enriches emotion and nuance. After rewiring, you no longer toggle, they coexist harmoniously inside your head. We must also talk about mental energy balance. Language learning can feel draining because you're burning energy on control. Once automated, you free that energy for creativity, humor, nuance. That's when you start playing with language instead of surviving it. You joke, improvise, invent metaphors. That freedom is both the symptom and the reward of neural rewiring. Grammar stops being an obstacle course, it becomes choreography. Every fluent bilingual reaches a moment of strange peace. The realization that grammar wasn't something to obey, it was something to embody. You feel tense distinctions as emotional shades. You use would to sound polite, might to sound humble, should to sound reflective. It's intuitive empathy encoded in syntax. That's the endgame, grammar transformed into mental rhythm of thought itself. When you reach that stage, English stops existing as knowledge. It becomes instinct. And if you listen carefully to yourself months from now, you'll hear the difference. You won't talk faster just because of confidence, you'll talk faster because your neurons learn the path of least resistance. You'll build sentences before finishing the previous ones. You'll synchronize meaning and sound. That's fluency at the biological level, efficient signal flow. The beauty of it is permanence. Once those circuits stabilize, they don't fade. You might rust from disuse, but the wiring remains, waiting for reactivation. So in plain English, thinking grammatically was step 1. Thinking structurally is step 2. Thinking conceptually is mastery. When grammar rules evolve into thought patterns, English becomes a lens, a system for analyzing experiences in chronological, explicit logic. You'll start noticing that your ideas sound clearer, even in your own native tongue, because English thought reinforces precision. That's the spillover effect of rewiring. Fluency upgrades your overall cognition. Let me close with a mental picture. Imagine 2 loops spinning inside your head. The first loop is control, small, rigid, safe. The second loop is connection, wide, flexible, alive. At the beginning of learning, control dominates, connection whispers underneath. Rewiring means transferring energy from control to connection. Every sentence you think directly in English speeds the second loop and weakens the first. One day you'll wake up and realize that English ideas emerge effortlessly, as if they were your own. Because by then, they are. You didn't memorize them, you became them. That's the real transformation. Grammar fading into intuition, structure merging with thought, language turning into mental motion. You stop following English rules and start thinking English thoughts. And when that happens, you've done far more than learn a language. You've rewired the loops of consciousness itself. Training the inner voice. How to make English your default mental soundtrack. You've probably never realized how loud your inner voice actually is. It comments on everything, narrates, reacts, rehearses, doubts, corrects, praises. Whether you're silent or speaking, that voice is active 24 hours a day. It's not just a background sound, it's the engine of thinking itself. And in language learning, that engine decides your destiny. Because fluency doesn't begin when you open your mouth, it begins when that voice starts speaking English without being told. Right now, your inner voice is bilingual but biased. It carries your native rhythm, idioms, even emotional patterns. Every thought passes through that filter before it reaches English. That's why you sometimes feel like English is a second system instead of a living one, because it depends on translation files stored inside that native narrator. The mission in this chapter is to retrain that narrator. To make English not just a language you use, but the default soundtrack of your conscious stream. Let's start by breaking a myth. Thinking in a new language is not a rare gift, it's a trained reflex. Anyone can achieve it if they understand the machinery of inner speech. When you think, your brain activates the same auditory cortex that processes real sound. In other words, you hear silent words in your head. Those neural echoes are shaped by the phonetic system you're most familiar with. That's why your thoughts have an accent. Literally. Neurolinguistic research calls this covert articulation, the invisible whisper your brain makes. Rewiring it in English doesn't happen by adding vocabulary, it happens by changing that covert soundtrack. The best analogy is musical. Imagine your brain as a playlist. Every track you've listened to repeatedly becomes easier to recall. The melody that dominates your mind will eventually become the one you hum subconsciously. If your default playlist is your first language, then English is just an imported file. You have to deliberately double-click it to play. Our goal is to make English autoplay when silence returns. That's not poetic exaggeration, it's neuroplastic truth. The circuits that fire most often during quiet reflection become dominant through a process called experience-dependent myelination. The more you think in English, even silently, the thicker those myelin sheets get around the English circuits. Thoughts literally travel faster in that direction. So how do you actually train this inner shift? There are 3 strategic layers: imitation, narration, and substitution. Imitation comes first. The inner voice can't create a new accent from scratch, it mimics what it hears. That's why immersion through listening is the foundation of internal English sound design. You need constant exposure to natural rhythm, not the mechanical English of textbooks, but real conversational tone, uncertainties, fillers, laughter. Because your inner narrator copies not only sounds but moods. If you feed it artificial textbook English, it internalizes stiffness. If you feed it lively authentic talk, it starts humming that melody inside even when you're alone. Listen not as a student, but as a future voice actor of your own mind. Narration is the next layer, turning your daily silence into English commentary. The simplest exercise ever invented, yet the most effective, the mental TV narrator. When you walk, cook, scroll, Or wait, describe what you see and feel in English internally. No translation, no grammar checks, just raw narration. The street is quieter today. I can't believe this line is so long. That smell reminds me of summer. You're replacing idle thought with practice. Over time, the mind adapts, silence becomes uncomfortable without English commentary. That's a sign the neural switch is flicking. The third layer, substitution, is subtler but powerful. It targets what psychologists call inner code dominance, the automatic language used for reacting, counting, swearing, joking, daydreaming. Those domains reveal your root linguistic identity. So start swapping them. Count in English. Whisper ouch instead of your native exclamation. Pray, plan, complain in English privately. At first it feels artificial, even pretentious. But repetition rewrites dominance. One day the substitution becomes so complete that emotional reaction itself surfaces in English before translation. That's the real milestone, when frustration hits and the first word that bursts inside your head is, seriously? Not its native equivalent. That's when English has claimed residency in your emotional circuitry. Let's dig into the neuroscience for accuracy. The default mode network, DMN, the part of the brain active during rest and self-talk, is the real training ground here. It's your mind's home screen. When you consciously narrate or substitute English in it, you're not just practicing vocabulary, you're editing the baseline code of self-communication. Over weeks, fMRI scans show measurable shift in resting state connectivity. The DMN begins favoring auditory-motor coupling that matches the practiced language. In plain English, your quiet mind starts thinking sound in English automatically. That's the cognitive equivalent of changing the operating system language, not just installing a translation app. But tread carefully, there's a psychological trap called mental interference. It happens when you force English into every thought too early. The brain resists overregulation, and fatigue sets in. You begin to hate the process. To avoid that, apply interval conditioning. Alternate between native silence and English narration like mental reps in a gym. 5 minutes English, 5 minutes rest. You're not proving discipline, you're programming spontaneity. Fluency is never born from exhaustion, only from rhythm. Another key idea here is voice identity. Your inner narrator has a tone, analytical, emotional, humorous, and it mirrors your personality. If your English inner voice doesn't yet sound like you, it stays external. You might speak correctly, but feel alien inside your sentences. Real fluency begins when the English voice expresses genuine emotion with your own personality palette. That requires personalization exercises. Writing private diaries in English, but not about language, about secrets, frustrations, small victories. These uncensored monologues teach your inner voice to link English words with authentic emotional charge. That bond is the glue of ownership. You stop borrowing English, you inhabit it. Here's an exercise that sounds small but rewires big: mirror thought repetition. Whenever you catch yourself thinking something in your native language, repeat the thought instantly in English, not translated word for word but reconstructed. Each reconstruction forces your brain to find the shortest natural English pathway between the same idea and its new expression. Do it hundreds of times quietly. It's brain coding at the micro level, the same way programmers replace old subroutines line by line. There's also a fascinating emotional side. Studies on bilingual self-perception show that people feel slightly different personalities, depending on the language of inner dialogue. In English, many report feeling more direct, decisive, or emotionally neutral. In their native languages, often more sentimental or indirect. This is not illusion, it's a shift in cognitive framing induced by grammar and vocabulary choices. To become deeply fluent, you have to embrace this dual identity instead of fearing loss of the original. Think of it as having two soundtracks for your inner film. You can switch depending on scene mood, but when you're operating in English, let its soundtrack play fully without crossfade static from the other one. That's not betrayal, it's precision of focus. Now, the mind resists bilingual interference through winner-takes-all dynamics. Neural competition decides which code gets majority activation. You can hack this mechanism by contextual labeling. Associate specific environments or activities exclusively with English inner dialogue. For example, every time you open your laptop or go jogging, declare that mental zone English-only territory. The consistency of context strengthens cue-dependent activation, so English automatically loads when the situation repeats. Little by little, English conquers more mental ground, until it becomes the default in most neutral contexts. That's how psychologists explain spontaneous bilingual switching. The context acts as a mental hotkey. But the process still feels abstract until you realize one thing: the inner voice is not just audio, it's thought shape. Each language uses different building blocks for imagery. English compresses ideas into verbs. Others expand them through adjectives or context. To think in English, visualize through actions, not descriptions. For example, instead of silently thinking, "The picture is beautiful," think, "This picture strikes me." The verb carries emotion and direction. When your inner voice builds imagery this way, your brain slowly reconfigures cognitive structure toward English motion-based logic. You're not just changing vocabulary, you're transforming spatial cognition. The most effective accelerator of this process is shadowing, real-time repetition of English audio with minimal delay. But we apply it differently here, not for pronunciation, but to align the tempo of thought. While you shadow, you're synchronizing your silent speech with native rhythm patterns. The more you align, the more your default inner tempo recalibrates. After consistent weeks, your spontaneous inner monologue adopts that pacing even without audio. You'll catch yourself pausing mid-sentence the way a native would. That's internal prosody aligning with external input. Let's talk about speed versus clarity, two competing metrics of inner fluency. At first, your English inner voice will sound slower than your native one because it's deliberate. That's normal. But aim for clarity first. Speed follows naturally once associations strengthen. Neuroscience shows that articulatory rehearsal, silently moving tongue and lips slightly while thinking in English, enhances recall speed by about 20%. Don't be shy, subvocalize. It bridges cognitive planning and pronunciation networks, fusing internal and external speech. That's where your English sound truly becomes felt, not just imagined. Here's the cognitive paradox. You can't access the emotional range of a language until your inner voice lives in it, but your inner voice won't move there until it feels emotional safety. That's why you must build intimacy with English through privacy first. Speak to yourself in English when no one's listening. Write private letters you'll never send. Record voicemails just to delete them. There's no judgment in privacy, and that's precisely the environment where neural risk-taking happens. Once your brain associates English with expressive safety, it stops quarantining it as a public performance language and merges it with your authentic voice. One major roadblock learners face here is semantic exhaustion, the feeling that English thoughts sound recycled, limited, boring. That's because your lexical orbit is small. Your brain keeps rotating the same dozen expressions. The fix is semantic widening through emotional adjectives, metaphor, and rhythm variation. When your inner monologue learns to say, "That's mildly terrifying," instead of "That's bad," or "I'm quietly proud" instead of "I'm happy," you expand the expressive texture of thought. Greater texture equals higher retention. Brains remember emotionally nuanced patterns more strongly than flat statements. In other words, adding style to your inner English accelerates automatization. Don't underestimate silence either. The absence of words is where the inner voice recalibrates. During meditative pauses, listen to mental noise. Which language begins whispering first? That's your dominance meter. the more often English arises spontaneously in those pauses, the deeper your rewiring. Celebrate those moments, not because they sound fluent, but because they happen uninvited. Every involuntary English thought means you've won another layer of unconscious trust from your own brain. Let's integrate all this into a concrete 10-minute daily protocol to train your inner voice. Minute 1 to 2. Play a short authentic English clip. Listen solely for rhythm and tone, not meaning. Minute 3 to 4. Shadow it softly out loud to synchronize tempo. Minute 5 to 6. Switch off the audio and internally replay what you remember, not exact words, just the mental music. Minute 7 to 8. Narrate your surroundings mentally in that same tone. Minute 9 to 10. Write one short internal diary sentence summarizing how you feel, no correction, no filters. Repeat daily. Within a month, you'll catch spontaneous English monologue fragments surfacing during random daytime drift. That's stage 1 of default soundtrack formation. Maintain consistency for 8 weeks and the shift becomes measurable in reaction time tests. The lag between stimulus and English response shrinks dramatically. That's stage 2, subconscious dominance. There's one last paradox to understand, the ego conflict between the two voices. Your original inner narrator may feel dethroned, producing mild identity dissonance. You might wonder, which language is the real me? The truthful answer, both are. You are not two selves, you are a larger self that owns two interfaces. Multilingual minds show increased gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for conflict resolution. Your brain physically grows more flexible by managing the dialogue between voices. You're not losing authenticity, you're gaining dimensionality. In the advanced stage of bilingual integration, the two voices no longer fight, they collaborate. You start borrowing metaphors across them, translating humor subconsciously, creating hybrid playfulness. That's artistry, not confusion. Artistic bilinguals do this instinctively, their inner voices jam together like musicians improvising, using whichever phrase on whichever beat fits the emotion best. That is the creative advantage of a rewired mind. Let's zoom out to the philosophical level. The inner voice defines how you experience reality itself. If your thoughts are now partly in English, then the world you perceive subtly shifts toward directness, analytical clarity, and motion-based imagery. That's not just vocabulary improvement, it's cognitive reframing of life. You begin describing experiences rather than labeling them. Instead of, I have a problem, you catch yourself thinking, I'm facing something. That linguistic rechoice alters emotional response. Problems shrink from identity into action. That's cognitive therapy wearing the mask of language learning. And this leads to the ultimate reward of building an English inner voice, mental freedom. When you think in multiple linguistic rhythms, you detach from automatic national or cultural assumptions embedded in a single tongue. You gain metacognition, the ability to observe thought rather than drown inside it. English becomes not just communication, but perspective, a silent laboratory where you analyze yourself from a distance. Every extra-linguistic voice you add increases your freedom to choose reactions consciously. Now, practical realism. Complete inner voice conversion takes time, roughly 3 to 6 months of consistent immersive self-talk. But progress isn't linear. Some days your mind will rebel, sliding back to the native tongue for comfort. Don't resist, observe. The more you notice the switch consciously, the less power it holds. Mindfulness neutralizes regression. Remember, we're retraining habit loops, not rewriting morality. Every relapse is just a data point on a growth curve. To conclude this chapter, let's revisit the simple truth we started with. You've been listening to a voice all your life. Language learning doesn't mean silencing it, it means teaching it to sing in a new key. English fluency doesn't truly arrive when your mouth stops hesitating, it arrives when your silence starts thinking in harmony with that same rhythm. When you narrate life involuntarily in English, you've achieved what textbooks can't measure. Internal fluency. So, tonight, before sleeping, as thoughts start fading, notice which language whispers the last sentence in your mind. If it's English, even one phrase, one emotional sigh, smile quietly. Because that small whisper is not random, it's the sound of new neural code writing itself. It's your mind, finally learning to think English without permission. Becoming bilingual in thought. Sustaining spontaneous fluency. Fluency is fragile. It's easy to spark, hard to sustain. You can spend months building the rhythm of English in your head, only to watch it fade when life gets busy, when you stop feeding that inner current. This final chapter isn't about learning more. It's about maintenance, the psychology of keeping your rewired mind alive, so the new language doesn't retreat into the shadows. Because bilingual fluency isn't a finish line. It's an ecosystem. It breathes, adapts, and depends entirely on how you live your daily mental life. Let's start with a truth most learners avoid. You don't forget a language, you simply stop activating it. Neural pathways don't vanish. They deactivate from lack of current. Like a city where the electricity remains wired but lights stay off. Sustaining fluency means keeping that current flow constant enough that the lights never dim, even when you're not consciously studying. Your goal is to make English an ambient process. Not an effortful activity, but a continuous low-level background hum in your mind. Think back to how you learned your first language. You didn't have practice days. You lived inside it. The words surrounded you, reacted to you, defined your world. Sustained bilingualism means recreating that environment artificially, but in a smarter, adult way. Adults can't immerse themselves the way children do physically, but they can engineer mental immersion, deliberate exposure, targeted curiosity, purposeful habit loops. It's not about adding hours, it's about adding constancy. The English current must never fall to zero. That constancy depends on 3 pillars: input, output, and reflection. Input keeps the neural map refreshed, output keeps motor skills sharp, reflection keeps cognitive identity balanced. Let's unpack them. Input first. After rewiring, passive listening is no longer passive, it's nutrition. Surround yourself with English audio that matches your affective state, not your vocabulary list. Choose voices that feel real, conversational, emotionally authentic. Any medium works: podcasts, vlogs, audiobooks, lectures, even random background conversations in cafes. But apply one rule. Don't just hear, overhear. The English soundscape should feel like weather, always present, sometimes noticed, sometimes not. That creates what neurolinguists call perceptual automaticity, your auditory system expecting English as default ambient noise. Once your brain expects it, comprehension remains fluent without conscious effort. Expectation is retention. Output is the harder maintenance task, because it requires courage. After each silence period, output rusts first, pronunciation dulls, phrasing stiffens. The fix is regular microproduction. Forget long speaking sessions. Think microbursts. 2 minutes of self-talk while driving. Short voice memos. Quick community replies on English forums. The frequency matters more than duration, because it keeps procedural memory activated. 10 daily micro-outputs do more for fluency than one long weekly conversation. It's motor maintenance, not performance art. Then comes reflection, the mature anchor holding bilingual identity steady. When you operate in 2 linguistic systems, your mind sometimes splits. English becomes logical and outward. Your native language stays emotional and inward. Without reflection, you risk living as two half-selves. Reflection reunites them. By journaling or meditating about your bilingual experience in English, you regain harmony between structure and emotion. That self-observation also reinforces metalinguistic awareness. You start noticing when your thoughts unconsciously switch codes. Every observation sharpens control. Sustainable bilingualism is conscious balance between contrast and integration. Behind these three pillars stands a deeper variable: motivation ecology. The motivation that drove you early, novelty, challenge, progress dopamine, will fade. Sustainable fluency runs on meaning, not excitement. You must internalize why you keep English alive. Maybe it's professional necessity, maybe worldview broadening, maybe cognitive fitness. Whatever your reason, feed it with fresh relevance. Link English daily to something that matters emotionally right now. Consume your hobbies, curiosities, future plans through English. Make the language instrumental, not ornamental. Instrumental usage cements permanence. There's also the crucial phenomenon of linguistic drift. Even native speakers experience it. Vocabulary evolves, idioms rotate, cultural references age. For bilinguals, drift becomes erosion if ignored. The antidote is synchronized updating. Periodically refresh your mental database by absorbing modern English, new slang, evolving norms, current discourse. Watch trending content occasionally. Read live online discussions. You're not chasing slang for popularity. You're syncing with living language physics. Static exposure produces fossilized English. Dynamic exposure keeps your neural simulation accurate. But sustaining fluency is not just cognitive, it's emotional endurance. At some point, you'll feel linguistic fatigue. The sense that you're living half a second behind when operating in a second language. That lag can create subtle shame, or social withdrawal. Recognize that as a biological normality. Your brain still runs cross-language interference patterns. The cure is self-compassion married with persistence. Every bilingual mind oscillates. Accepting that oscillation constructs psychological resilience. True mastery is rhythmic, not rigid. Here's an image. Fluency maintenance is like keeping a musical instrument tuned in a humid climate. You don't overhaul the instrument weekly. You make micro-adjustments daily. If it detunes slightly, you tighten strings instead of panicking. Likewise, if your English feels clumsy after time off, treat it like tuning, not failure. Read aloud 10 minutes, watch something engaging, shadow a favorite narrator. The resonance will return. The skill never disappeared. The pitch drifted. Patience is precision. Now let's bring in the neuroscience one final time. Remember from Chapter 2 how procedural memory houses fluent output, and declarative memory stores facts and grammar? Sustaining fluency means ensuring the procedural circuits stay well myelinated. Myelin maintenance depends on repeated signal firing and adequate rest. That's why frequent short practice beats long irregular ones. Frequent impulses tell oligodendrocytes to keep insulating English pathways. Est consolidates them. It's biological rhythm, not academic willpower. There's another layer. Cross-language transfer. Once you become bilingual in thought, languages begin to enrich, not fight, each other. Concepts get cross-tagged, a neurological phenomenon, where meaning clusters overlap across codes. This is where sustained bilingualism becomes a creative superpower. Writers, scientists, and innovators exploit it. The friction of switching perspectives generates insight. So sustaining English fluency isn't only about preventing decay. It's about multiplying cognition. You now own two perception systems that can converse. Keep them talking. When thinking deeply, occasionally ask, how would this sound in English? That question reframes logic through structure, forcing new mental routes. Cognitive scientists call it lateral conceptual expansion. Fluent thinkers use it instinctively. Let's be practical again. The simplest fluency sustain tool is habit fusion. Instead of dedicating separate study time, fuse English into existing routines. Read news headlines in English when you check your phone. Switch device UI language. Think shopping lists in English terms. Replace multitasking nonsense with linguistic micro-immersion. You're not adding workload. You're replacing neutral habits with Englishized ones. Sustainability equals invisibility, fluency that hides inside daily life so routine itself becomes training. But sustainability also requires defending attention from digital clutter. Social feeds and translation shortcuts corrode internal processing, because they encourage surface comprehension, without inner speech. Every time you auto-translate, you weaken the loop of active construction. Guard that loop fiercely. Encounter a new word? Infer from context first, feel its texture, then check meaning. You're keeping the generative engine healthy. Fluency isn't memory. It's metabolism. The moment you outsource curiosity, you starve it. One of the finest techniques for long-term bilingual vitality is inner dialogue alternation. Spend some minutes conversing with yourself as two characters, one in English, one in your native tongue. Argue a topic. Let perspectives clash. It may sound eccentric, but it generates meta-awareness. Switching back and forth trains contextual agility. Eventually, both voices start borrowing expressions from each other, creating hybrid cognition. When that happens, you've transcended translation boundaries entirely. You're no longer switching languages. You're blending thought grammars into a unified cognitive symphony. But such depth requires emotional calibration. There's a known phenomenon: the bilingual emotional gap. Emotions expressed in a second language feel slightly muted, until strong autobiographical experiences accumulate in that language. To cross that gap, live real emotions in English. Laugh genuinely, argue spontaneously, fall silent meaningfully in English contexts. Emotion cements memory stronger than repetition. When a real feeling bonds with English words, those words become part of your nervous system. That's sustainable fluency in its truest sense, vocabulary linked to lived emotion. Now let's address long-term plateaus. After reaching comfort, progress feels invisible. You speak well, think clearly, yet feel stagnant. That's because growth transitions from external improvement to internal subtlety. The noticeable leaps are over. Now micro-refinements define mastery. To detect them, shift your metric from what you can say to how precisely you can feel while saying. Can you express sarcasm delicately? Can you adjust tone to empathy? That sophistication marks continuum growth. The more emotionally precise your English becomes, the deeper the wiring settles. Sustainability also involves maintaining accent acceptance. At maturity, chasing native pronunciation can become a trap that undermines confidence. Your accent is your cognitive fingerprint, proof of dual processing, not imperfection. Linguistically, accent signals efficiency. Your articulatory map stabilized. Shift focus from imitation to intelligibility. The goal isn't sounding native. It's sounding natural, speech aligned with thought speed. When those align, syntax disappears, communication emerges, identity stabilizes. That's fluent equilibrium. Let's not overlook rest. Rest is underrated cognitive fertilizer. During sleep, the hippocampus replays linguistic traces, strengthening cortical memories. Chronic fatigue sabotages this consolidation. So, paradoxically, sustaining fluency sometimes means doing nothing, giving the mind silence to integrate. Without downtime, even practice turns noise. Rest isn't emptiness. It's rehearsal in darkness. Now come the future-proofing strategies. How to ensure English remains alive amid shifting life priorities. There are 3 durable methods: purpose rotation, community embedding, and self-renewal. Purpose rotation means periodically redefining why English matters. Maybe the first motive was self-improvement. Later it could become mentorship or research dissemination. When purpose evolves, motivation regenerates. Make English the tool for your next curiosity: reading technical papers, writing articles, coaching newcomers. Rotation prevents stagnation by reattaching language to new dopamine triggers. Community embedding anchors sustainability through social connections. Join one authentic English-speaking group aligned with genuine interest, not a textbook club. It could be an online forum about marine ecology or game design, a subreddit on smart cities, anything. When English becomes the shared medium for meaningfully discussing your expertise, practice becomes identity maintenance. Social accountability sustains what discipline alone can't. And then self-renewal, perhaps the most philosophical principle. Every fluent bilingual faces existential fatigue. Why keep sharpening this? The answer lies in viewing English not as skill, but as training for cognitive elasticity. Operating 2 languages continuously strengthens executive control, attention switching, and empathy. It's the mental gym you can never outgrow. Each conversation refreshes, not just vocabulary but adaptability itself. The longer you sustain bilingualism, the younger your brain stays in function. That's not a metaphor. It's empirically supported neuroprotection. Let's contemplate culture for a moment. Sustained bilingualism expands not only mental capacity, but moral horizon. Thinking in English means thinking through another civilization's metaphors, openness, directness, hypothesis testing. When your thoughts traverse both linguistic cultures fluidly, you develop conceptual empathy, the awareness that reality can be described truthfully, in more than one grammar. That insight makes you intellectually humble and socially agile. In an interconnected world, that's power. Of course, equilibrium will never be perfect. There will always be leakage. Words slipping between systems, moments of confusion, fatigue after bilingual days. But that's not failure. That's the operational cost of expanded consciousness. The very struggle confirms you're operating at a higher complexity level than monolingual thought. Accept friction as proof of evolution. Here's a closing metaphor. Imagine 2 rivers merging. At the confluence, currents swirl chaotically, particles mix unpredictably. But downstream, the water stabilizes broader and stronger than either original river. That's your bilingual mind after full integration. The turbulence is transitional. Sustained flow is calm power. Now zoom into the personal level again. What sustains spontaneous fluency day to day? Rituals. Small, consistent anchors that remind the brain daily who it has become. The morning podcast habit. The nighttime English recap in your journal. The weekly chat with an international colleague. Each act is a neural heartbeat. Miss one, and nothing collapses. Miss them all, and the language heart weakens. Sustainability is micro-ritual compounded. Not heroic effort, and when over time English becomes fully natural, you'll hit the paradox of invisibility. You won't notice you're thinking in English anymore. That's the real graduation ceremony, quiet and unspectacular. You may suddenly realize your dreams started using English dialogue, or that you get emotional watching a film without subtitles. Those are graduation milestones, language crossing into identity. Let's finish with one final experiment. Sit now, eyes closed, silent. Ask yourself a question about your own life. Any question. Notice the first words that your mind selects to phrase it internally. What language is that sound? If it's English, even partly, then the project is already complete in essence. Because one's thought itself fluctuates naturally between codes. You are bilingual not just in communication but in consciousness. That's the summit of this entire journey. Not performing English for the world, not impressing or proving, simply thinking freely across two linguistic realities, as one coherent mind. True bilinguals aren't those who can switch languages. They are those who no longer feel the switch. Sustaining spontaneous fluency means living in that seamless mental landscape indefinitely, tuning it gently, feeding it daily, trusting its resilience. So let every quiet moment confirm the work you've done. The rewired loops of grammar, the trained inner voice, the reframed cognition, all still humming beneath thought. You're no longer translating life, you're narrating it natively in two keys. That's mastery. That's permanent fluency. And as long as you keep listening inwardly, responding outwardly, and reflecting consciously, English will never again be something you study. It will simply be something you are.